Welcome to Norse Code, the number one podcast for your Minnesota Vikings. I am the host with the moster, Dusty O'Connell. Joining me is our customary in-house analyst, Vikings blogger extraordinaire, and all-around useful human, Arif Hassan. How you doing, Arif?
I'm doing pretty well, man. How are you?
Yeah, I'm all right. Hanging in there. Battling the never-ending stream of technical difficulties that goes along with hosting and producing a podcast. But, what else is new?
Life is so difficult for you, man.
It's the struggle is a little too real, but it wouldn't be art if I didn't suffer for it, right? So
yeah.
I realize that calling this art is a bit of a stretch, but let's just go with it. Hey, we get paid a lot more than other artists do. I can promise you that. And
that's true.
I'm very excited to introduce what I believe is the first episode of Norse Code with two disparate guests, both in service of kind of the same theme, which is coaching and coaching schemes. We've got guests that have worked with both Pat Shurmur or are familiar, I guess, with Pat Shurmur and Tony Sperano separately. Joining us first will be Ben Natan, and then after that, Ted Nguyen. But before we get to the interviews, I would like to take a moment to thank all of our listeners for tuning in. And, it's funny, 5 out of the last 7 weeks, we have set single-day download records for the show. So more people are listening on our first day than ever before, week after week. So thank you for telling your friends and spreading the good word about Norse Code. Beyond that, I would like to thank Jeremy Kittless in particular for contributing $20 to the show via PayPal. Thank you so much for your contribution. That will go a long way towards keeping the lights on here, keeping us fully stocked with all the purchasable goodies that the football community likes to pump out in service of better analytics and better prognostication. And all of that is made possible by contributors like Jeremy and the 20 people who are ongoing supporters of the show. If you would like to become a recurring supporter, go to patreon.com/NorseCode and contribute whatever amount you would like per month, from $1 to $1 million. If you've got $1 million a month, maybe Norse Code isn't the smartest place to spend it, but if you choose to spend it here, we promise to use that money only for good.
Yeah, like mansions. Good mansions.
Yeah, exactly. Like one really good studio / mansion for friends. is going to be our primary strategy there. If you would like to make a one-time donation of $1 million or some pedestrian smaller amount, you can do that as well by going to paypal.me/NorseCode. And that will conclude the listener support promo portion of the show. Let us go straight to the interview. Welcome to the show, Ben. This is your first time here. We're glad to have you.
I'm glad to be on.
Yeah, no, you and I talk a lot on Twitter. I kind of give you a little bit too much shit, so I'm sorry about that.
No, it's okay. I'm used to it.
Yeah, I guess you're an Eagles fan.
Yeah, well, I deserve it most of the time.
Well, let's talk about that. So we'll talk, a lot about like Pat Shurmur and the scheme and coaching and stuff like that. But first, I just kind of wanted to ask you, sort of, what got you into football? What you're doing now, because I think that's actually kind of interesting in terms of like people who talk about football. And then also, like, why are you qualified to talk about football with us on the show?
Well, I grew up with my grandfather being my main influence with sports. I lived on the same father, and he has a collection of old Eagles tapes dating back to the early 1980s. And he spent basically my entire childhood trying to get me into the Eagles and bringing me to games and watching them on TV. And I was having a hard time getting. I know. I mean, I always had a hard time getting into it because I was a theater kid growing up. I'd been doing theater since I was 3 years old, and football never really appealed to me as much as it should have until I think 7th or 8th grade. All my friends were playing Madden, and I kind of felt left out. So I started playing Madden, and I got really obsessed with it because I started just like learning all the players, and I thought all like the different like schematic things were really, really cool. And that's really where my obsession started. And then it branched out, or I actually really started watching football. And like the year I got really, really, really into football. I mean, I'd always watched the Eagles and kind of appreciated the Eagles, but the year I really watched like outside of just Eagles football, I think was 2009. So it was the year right before Michael Vick's big like breakout comeback player of the year season.
Yeah, it was Brett Favre's year.
Yeah. So I was like, I got really into football, and then in 2010, the 2010 season, you know, the Eagles had that crazy season with Michael Vick, and there was all this hype, and he got that huge contract after that. And then the Eagles had a draft. They had 11 picks in the 2011 draft, or 10 picks in the 2011 draft, and then they signed Dominic Rodgers-Cromartie and whatever. So there was all this hype.
I actually don't remember the draft. I remember all the free agency.
Yeah, and the team completely tanked, and I mean, this is like the famous Dream Team story, and I was so curious as to why that happened, and then I kind of started like looking. I was like, what is the draft? Like, what does that even mean? Because I was reading stuff about how, you know, Danny Watkins was really bad in his rookie year, and the Eagles didn't get enough contributions from their rookie draft picks, and I was like, what? Like, is there a science to this whole thing? And I got really interested in it. I think that was I want to say that was my sophomore year of high school. And I was like, oh, this is really cool. And I found videos online of like different draft prospects, and I started watching them for the 2012 draft, and I was like taking notes on them. And I was like, oh, well, this guy, I mean, it was really elementary, like looking back, I have on my old computer, I have some of my notes, and I have like notes of like Michael Floyd. And it was like, he can jump really high, like shit like that. And awesome. It's funny, like looking at in elementary terms, and then looking at what I write now. It's like, why do I try to make it any more difficult than I did? You know, when I was 15 years old, I could have just stayed with he jumps really high. But I did that, and in 2013, I actually got to put my stuff online somewhere, and I started. You know, there was like small podcasts that were bringing me on because I started tweeting about it all, like tweeting about my football opinion all the time. And I had to make a new Twitter account because my high school friends who were following me on my other Twitter account were like, can you, like, we don't want to fucking hear about Monty Ball. Like, just take this shit elsewhere. And I was like, all right, fine. So I made another Twitter account, and Pete Smith, who had a website called With the First Pick, eventually noticed me and was like, here, come write for me, kid. So I did that from the end of my junior year of high school all the way through about the first 3 months of my freshman year of college. And then I had a brief stint with a website that doesn't exist anymore called Football Savages, and I was doing draft stuff for them as well, and also some NFL content. And then Bleeding Green Nation, which is the SB Nation website for the Eagles, they noticed me, and they were like, here, like, we need a new draft writer, come be our draft guy. And, you know, over a year later, they haven't fired me yet, surprisingly, despite the comment section, which I know you love so much, Arif.
Yeah, no, it's an amazing comment section. So for people who are not familiar with Ben's work, you should head over to bleedinggreennation.com, click on his articles, one, because clicks are always good, but two, so that you can head over to the comment section and see how they treat Ben. I think it is a delight.
It's hilarious. It's really, really funny. It really only has to do with one thing. It really just has to do with the whole quarterback thing. And I know that people get all emotional and defensive about their quarterbacks. So I don't really. I mean, I do blame them. I do blame them, but you know, I can kind of understand getting upset because someone doesn't like the quarterback that their team just traded the world for.
Is it more or less toxic than YouTube comments?
It's pretty bad. I mean,
ooh, wow.
I've been accused of some pretty. I was accused of sleeping with Paxton Lynch, which is about as just to clear the air, like, I'm not sleeping with Paxton Lynch. I just want to make that very clear to everyone listening.
Dear playground.
Pretty short. That would be a pretty great image.
That would, oh, Jesus. Yeah, I try to go for people who are shorter than me. So I don't know if the 6'8" Memphis quarterback would really fit into my type.
So does Paxton Lynch.
He really only has one option. He can really only pick people who are shorter than him.
Well, let's talk about that. I know we're going to talk a little bit about Pat Shurmur, but Carson Wentz is just such an interesting topic. So it's not so much that he's a bad quarterback to pick in a draft somewhere. It's what the Eagles moved mountains for this guy to pick him at number 2, and so he's got a lot of positives. But the issues are you have to start looking at a lot of these negatives when he's like the number 2 overall pick. So what are your biggest concerns about this guy?
Oh man, it's a list, man.
Pick 2.
Pick 2. Well, for non-Power 5 quarterbacks to be drafted in the first round, he has the least pass attempts of all of them by over 330. And
we were talking about this. Yeah,
the next most prolific quarterback was J.P. Losman, and so he has 650 career pass attempts in college at the FCS level. He's almost 24 years old. He's started less games in the last 9 years than Jared Goff started in the last 3. And he just from an experience standpoint, it's just this terrifying dearth of experience for a nearly 24-year-old rookie.
Too?
I believe so, and he was a backup most of the time. And also, North Dakota State had a better record without him than they did with him, which is concerning.
That's one loss, Ben.
And then on top of that, he's also just a really raw passer. I mean, he's a one read type of guy. He's not really, he has a big arm, but he's not accurate down the field, and he's just numb in the pocket too. And I think you were the one who came up with the Zach Mettenberger comparison, and that's basically where he's at. He's a little bit more athletic than Mettenberger, and I'll give him credit. Yes, he does have a big arm and he's athletic, and he's an aggressive passer, which I can definitely appreciate after watching Sam Bradford for the last year. But there's so little experience, and there's so much for him to work on that just the price that the Eagles paid for him is maddening, honestly. It really doesn't make sense, and the hype revolving around him didn't make sense. And it's funny I say that, considering that I was one of the first people to be like, hey, this guy could possibly be pretty good, and then he ended up just not improving from where I thought he'd end up. Right. But you know what, I'm gonna root for him, obviously, because I'm a fan of the team, and he's an easy guy to root for. I'll give him that. I mean, he's corny and boring as hell, but he's a nice guy, works hard, very confident. He has red hair, so I have red hair. So there's this natural I need to root for him, or I'll just get more shit. Be like, oh, your doppelganger just threw another interception. It's all right, fine. Yeah. So that those are my.
So then I think the inevitable question, or the question that's most obvious to me, given sort of the list of your concerns, what are the differences as a prospect in terms of evaluating him versus evaluating Cam Newton? Because the person you described, aside from the words FCS, could very well describe Cam Newton, the number 1 overall pick in 2011. Turned out to be pretty all right.
I mean, that's true, but I mean, even from a statistical standpoint, Cam Newton was a lot more prolific at Auburn than Wentz was at North Dakota State, and both as a passer and a rusher. I don't have the exact numbers in front of me, but I'm pretty sure Cam Newton had 50 total touchdowns and about 4,500 yards, or maybe 4,000.
It was one of the greatest college football seasons.
I mean, yeah, and that's one of the things. If you're going to draft a guy who only has 1 season of experience, or in Cam Newton also had JUCO experience, but if you're drafting a guy with that. Yeah, if you're drafting a guy with that little experience like Cam Newton or, Carson Wentz had, you want them to really dominate the competition that they're playing around. And Cam Newton, he came in, he dominated. He had I think he had something. He had a very few pass attempts. He actually had less pass attempts over the course of his career than Carson Wentz, but he also rushed the ball 260 times his final year at Auburn. He was just absolutely dominant. Team went undefeated. He won the Heisman. They beat Oregon in the national championship, and then he blew up the combine. So all of the metric points were there for Cam, and he was also a younger prospect, if I recall correctly.
Right. He was younger than Carson, but not by a
ton. And with Wentz, Wentz was never even an All-American in his own conference. That should be a minor concern. The fact that he wasn't even recognized as the best player in his conference each of the 2 years that he was playing in it. And if you throw on the Brock Jensen tape, that's a little bit of a throwback. Brock Jensen, the former North Dakota State quarterback.
Yeah, UDFA signed to the Packers. I remember Brock.
Yeah, if you watch Brock, it's really not that different than Carson. Just like it's watching like the same thing, and Brock was a lot more prolific during his time there. So, and if you look at North Dakota State with and without Wentz, it's not that big of a difference. Where you look at Auburn with and without Cam Newton. I mean, Cam Newton took that program over the top, and they completely tanked after that. After he left. So, I have issues with the Cam Newton comparison for the most part. Okay. But he's Carson's a nice guy, so I'm rooting for him.
All right. Well, for me, hopefully your rooting goes astray. For you, hopefully it goes well.
I
just hate Indies. So,
Well, I mean, that's fair. And if he ends up being bad, I get to gloat. So, I mean, it's kind of like a win-win situation for me. But
let's talk a little bit about Pat Shurmur. So the Vikings signed him to be a tight end coach with the Vikings, but his actual role on the team is going to be at least a little bit, if not a lot larger. He is either, depending on who you ask, the offensive coordinator in waiting until Norv retires, or a guy who's going to have a lot of input in the offense, particularly when it comes to the passing game. He had a lot, or a little, I don't know, of input in the passing game with Philadelphia as the passing coordinator, sort of offensive coordinator, under Chip Kelly. What can you tell us about what his role was, how involved he was, and what it means to be the passing coordinator?
Yeah, I think in Philadelphia, Shurmur's main thing was being able to work with the quarterbacks, and that's where he really cut his teeth as a quarterback coach. And because Chip has never really had the ability, or has never had this propensity to develop and work with quarterbacks. Chip is more of a running game coordinator, and he inserted his passing concepts into the Philadelphia offense. But I think that Shurmur really operated as the quarterback coach, and he was also bringing a lot of West Coast principles to the offense as well, which is where he had a lot of experience in Philadelphia under Andy Reid a couple years ago, and then he took those talents to work with Sam Bradford actually during his rookie year, and then he had an unfortunate stint in Cleveland. So yeah, his main role was, he brought some West Coast principles, and then I think he was really the true quarterback coach. I thought it was interesting. Both times that Bill Lazor got hired to the Dolphins, and then Bill Musgrave got hired to the Raiders to be their offensive coordinator, and they're like, oh yeah, well these guys worked with the quarterbacks in Philadelphia, and they were so prolific under Chip Kelly, and it's obviously directly attributed to them. When I never really thought that was true. I thought it was more, Kelly's offense, and then also Shurmur's tutelage as the true quarterback coach. I think that the other guys, Lazor and Musgrave, were more like assistant quarterback coaches.
Okay. So then I think sort of the question about Nick Foles comes up then. So if he's kind of a quarterback coach or whatever, or is largely involved in the development of the quarterback, what happened positively and negatively with Foles? What would you attribute his astounding statistical success to? Is it luck? Is it the unfamiliarity with the NFL scheme? What is it? And then what would you attribute his rapid fall from grace to? And what of that can be attributed to Shurmur?
I think Foles' success, it's in part due to luck, but also because the supporting cast. I mean, the offense was just clicking at such a high level that year, and the offensive line stayed healthy the entire season. McCoy had one of the best. I mean, had just an absolutely incredible season for a running back, and because of that, teams were game planning to stop the run, and because of the presence of Deshaun Jackson, it just gave the offense this duality where teams really couldn't come up on the offense, or they would get burned deep. And if they try to stay deep to stop Jackson, you're going to have McCoy run all over them. So Foles had the ability to really pick apart offenses because they were never really keying in on trying to stop the pass, and you had this great vertical threat over the top. And another thing with Foles, and I'm going to credit Foles. I mean, he's not a good quarterback by any means, and we know this now. Is he's a very, very aggressive quarterback. So he's willing to, Kelly and Shurmur schemed up a lot of shots into the offense, a lot of shot plays, and Foles had no issue going to those shot plays and taking shots deep down the field. So I think that just the aggressiveness of Foles, combined with just that high level of efficiency that the offense was clicking at, especially with the running game, was what produced such a really incredible statistical season for him in 2013. And then in 2014, the offensive line regressed. They got injured really early in the season. Jason Kelsey and Evan Mathis both got injured really early on. McCoy got injured in preseason. He had turf toe that he was dealing with for much of the season, which really affected the efficiency of the running game. So Foles was the window started getting tighter, and Foles started forcing. I mean, he was always forcing passes, but he was forcing a lot of passes and just turning the ball over a lot. And it really, really reflect. I mean, he didn't take a step forward, which is definitely worrying, both for him and the coaching staff. But that's what really kind of, that was kind of his fall from grace. Just the supporting cast around him fell apart, and the offense actually looked a lot better that year when Mark Sanchez came in and was just able to kind of game manage. And I think that's where you see. You can see the flexibility with Shurmur and see the flexibility with Chip's scheme, where there's always a vertical element worked in, but there can also be that kind of dink and dunk type of thing that could work if the quarterback is smart enough. And in Sanchez's case, he had a couple of games where he was really, really able to work the middle of the field and work that short game very well, and gave the offense a great opportunity to win in those games that he was playing efficiently.
Well, I'm glad you mentioned Sanchez, because that was actually the next question I wanted to ask. He actually looked pretty good. Which is the weirdest thing. I remember watching him 2009, 2010, and trying to argue with people that actually, despite the team's success, he was not a good quarterback. Despite that, I think that sort of the opposite is what happened with Sanchez in Philadelphia. He looked, a lot better than I thought he would. And it wasn't just, I think that you make a good point about like the fact that he is making, not just good decisions, but he was making them quickly within the rhythm of the offense. But, he was responding to pressure better. He was reading defenses a little bit better. Do you think, that has to do with Sanchez sitting? Do you think it has to do with his experience? Or do you think Shurmur had a role in improving Sanchez, the quarterback?
I think it definitely speaks to the coaching staff, and if you juxtapose the coaching staff in Philadelphia with what he was dealing with the Jets, he had a much more quarterback and offensive friendly coaching staff that he was working with. And I mean, the main thing for Sanchez is he just looked like he was loose. He just looked like he was comfortable. He wasn't putting any pressure on himself, and he just looked really comfortable out on the field. And I think that what happened in New York is he didn't really have any support from the coaching staff, or at least the support that they were giving him wasn't really well led. And once he started screwing up, they put more and more and more pressure on him, and he just completely fell apart. And I think that's something that really has to do with all quarterbacks. Is a lot of quarterback success has to do with the organizational confidence and support around them. And Sanchez just looks so much more comfortable. And I think a big part of that is Shurmur, because one thing you definitely hear from the players and other coaches about Shurmur is how well he can actually, how well he can work with players and how well he can connect with players, which I think is definitely something he picked up from working with Andy Reid for such a long time, because God knows he didn't pick it up from Chip Kelly.
That's true. Chip not necessarily well known for personnel management, I suppose. But with how that may translate to how Shurmur's working with the Vikings, you mentioned like West Coast tendencies. You mentioned like there's like a mix of outlets / management options and aggressive options within the style of the offense. All of that. What do you think that he's either gained in Philadelphia or that he brought with him in Philadelphia? Do you think that he can bring with him into Minnesota to either help the development of Teddy Bridgewater or improve the passing game overall? Like, what do you think would be his primary influence?
I think that if he's going to take anything from Philadelphia, and this seems like such a cliche thing to say, I think he really learned the value of pace and also space. And you saw that with Musgrave and Laser when they went to Miami and Oakland, is that they tried to use the spread offense, use spread formation a lot more or spread formations a lot more often, rather than trying to condense the field as much as possible. And Shurmur had tendencies prior to Philadelphia where he was doing very, very classic old school type of passing concepts, and I think coming to Philadelphia allowed him to really branch out and explore, or at least see the potential in being able to spread the field and using more spread concepts in his offense. And I'm not sure how much he's going to be involved in the running game, but at least in the passing game, I think you're going to see a lot more diversity from him than you would have seen prior to Philadelphia.
Okay, cool. So in terms of maybe his role, because not a lot of people are confident in the idea that Scott Turner, Norv Turner's son, is sort of the true quarterback coach with the Vikings. So in terms of just his quarterback coaching, do you think that he'll have an opportunity to do positive things with Teddy Bridgewater, or do you think that this is a situation where maybe there's too many cooks in the kitchen, and maybe Shermer should stay away from just adding his voice to the cacophony of voices? Like, what do you think would be the best based on what you know of Shermer in Philadelphia?
I think Shermer's history really speaks to him being a good quarterback coach. Every quarterback that's really played under him has had their best seasons under him. I mean, Bradford had two of his best statistical seasons working with Shermer, both his rookie year and this past year. Donovan McNabb enjoyed some of his best statistical seasons when Shermer was the quarterback coach. And then you had like Nick Foles playing really well, and then Mark Sanchez looking a lot better in Philadelphia than he did ever in New York. So I think that giving him an opportunity to work with Teddy Bridgewater would be really positive, because not only have all these quarterbacks succeeded under him, but I think that Shermer's experience really helps him bring something to the table that maybe Scott Turner does not have.
No, fair enough. And technically, he's a tight ends coach. Is there anything that you can glean? Because it doesn't look like he has a history of specifically coaching tight ends, but I mean, he's coached at basically every level of the offense. Is there anything you can glean from that, from like his ability to improve tight end coaching? I know Minnesota fans are kind of disappointed with like how Kyle Rudolph has developed and stuff like that.
I can't speak directly to his impact on tight ends, but I can say that he started his career in Philadelphia as the tight end and offensive line coach.
Oh, okay, great.
And he got promoted after, I think, 2 years to be the quarterback coach.
Okay. If the Vikings see Norv Turner retire and they're choosing between like Sparano and Shermer, what are the things that you expect from Shermer if he becomes the offensive coordinator, or what are the things that would make him a good or bad offensive coordinator?
I think what would make him a good offensive coordinator, and I don't really have a lot of knowledge of what Norv Turner has been doing, but Shermer does a really good job of playing to players' strengths. And what a big issue from what I've seen of Teddy Bridgewater, and also people's perception of Teddy Bridgewater, is that everyone's kind of making Teddy to be this really conservative, like Alex Smithy type of quarterback. And I think that really undersells what Bridgewater has done and can do, because when you saw Bridgewater at Louisville, he was this not a great deep passer, but he was a very aggressive passer because he had a wide receiver that he knew could dominate in those type of situations, and he used that. And I think a big issue is that he hasn't really had the opportunity, and he hasn't really had the players to exploit that kind of big ball, as I like to call it. And because of the personnel around him, he's kind of forced to play small ball. And, his best receiver during his 2-year career has been Stephon Diggs, who is more of that in between the 20s type of receiver. And I think what you'd see with Shermer, especially with the new talent coming in, with the Vikings just drafting Laquan Treadwell, is I think that Shermer would take a lot more advantage of what Treadwell can do as a receiver, and kind of put Teddy in situations where he's playing more of that big ball type of passing, and also using Stephon Diggs primarily as an in-between-the-20s guy. I think Shermer's really smart in terms of just identifying player strengths and looking to exploit them in the best way possible. If I read the narrative correctly, I don't think that's been the case with Turner.
Not quite.
That is a small understatement.
What's that, Dusty?
That is a small understatement.
Yeah, not quite. We've had a lot of issues with, the implementation of a 7-step dropping game and a weak offensive line. At the same time, not having receivers that can take advantage at the time that's theoretically afforded you in a 7-step drop game. As well as like the integration of Peterson into the offense and stuff like that. That all seems to be a lot different than what Shermer's doing, which, regardless of like you mentioned, his ability to take advantage of this player's strengths, regardless of that, it also seems like Shermer tends to draw up plays that are a little bit quicker for the quarterback to get rid of the ball, and like you said, there's a spread space element which tends to lend itself to sort of quicker drop back passing games. Do you think that that's something that would be an advantage for the Vikings going forward if they, did want to look in Shermer's direction?
Yeah, and I think once again it really speaks to his ability to kind of conform to the talent that he's dealing with. Because if you look at what Nick Foles was doing 2 years ago, I mean, Nick Foles is really this. I'm trying to think of a really nice way to say this. He's like this big, dumb see and throw type of passer. So that was kind of really just like the deep, the deep shot plays, like let him drop back, good offensive line, sit, read the field, get the ball out, throw the ball down the field type of situation. But when he was dealing with a shoddier offensive line and dealing with quarterbacks like Sanchez and Bradford, who are more conservative, trying to be nice about all this stuff. He did a really good job of scheming up the short, quick rhythm type of passing game and being able to get both Bradford and Sanchez comfortable. So I think he can really work to the strengths and weaknesses of the Vikings offensive line and what Teddy can do as a passer. So, which I think is what's so good about him. And also I think something that he might have picked up from Kelly is just the ability to identify the strengths and weaknesses of his team and let them do what they do best instead of trying to pigeonhole them into any one type of scheme, which I think is what Turner's doing.
Okay, so that's so I think that's a pretty good rundown of Shurmur, his involvement in the Philadelphia offense, and how he may influence sort of the Vikings in general. We've got a couple of minutes before we can let you go. Do you have any thoughts about the Vikings draft, or Teddy Bridgewater in general that you want to just share?
What I know of the Vikings draft, I really loved their first two picks. I was a big Laquan. It was funny because the Laquan Treadwell hype train was all over the place the past year. If you asked someone about a year ago, he was Des Bryant. And then if you ask someone like 2 months ago, he was Mohamed Sanu. So it really went all over the place. And I always really found myself somewhere in the middle of that conversation where I was like, he's not quite Des Bryant, but he's still pretty good. And he's just a really, really physical and natural football player, and he can play the catch point really well. And I think what's going to be so great about his presence in the offense, and I kind of touched on it before, is that he gives Teddy that my ball type of receiver that he hasn't had since he was throwing to Devontae Parker back at Louisville, and the presence of Devontae Parker is in part what helped Teddy be so prolific at Louisville, and Teddy's ability to exploit Devontae Parker's ability at the catch point. And because he hasn't had, the closest thing he's had to like a my ball receiver in Minnesota is what, like Kyle Rudolph? Like I don't even know who their like big targets are down in the red zone.
Well, I know who's big. I don't know who's a my ball receiver.
Yeah, exactly. And I think that Treadwell is going to give the offense that element, and then by giving the offense that element, it also lets them use Stephon Diggs more as that second, in between the 20s type of guy. And you're going to see Teddy really open up this year and be a lot more prolific, especially down in the red zone. And then I also love the Mackenzie Alexander pick, because that was another thing that was weird. The Vikings drafted two of my favorite players in the draft, and also drafted two guys whose media hype was just all over the place, because people weren't talking about Mackenzie Alexander that much before the season started. Then the season started and everyone's like, wow, this guy's really, really, really good. And then the season ended. He didn't test well. He's shorter. He didn't have any interceptions. And then everyone's like, oh, this guy's horrible. And I was like, wait, no, that's not how this works. Like, he's still good. Like the tape is still there. And I understand concerns about his athleticism, and yeah, the production thing's a little weird, but he also had 4 dropped interceptions too. And if he caught just 2 of those, we wouldn't be as this wouldn't even be a concern. He's just a really, he is smaller, but he's really, really smart. And he had I think Doug Farr had this great all 22 breakdown with Mackenzie Alexander. I think it was Doug. And he's just a really, really smart football player, very, very quick, and he's really physical and really nasty. I kind of get, I love players who talk a lot of shit, and I don't know what it is. It's probably just me, as a person, I talk a lot of shit, in real life, so I probably just see myself. I was like, oh, here's a short guy who's talking shit on the field, this is me. But I thought Mackenzie Alexander was a really good player. I still do. And then he fell to the second round, and the Vikings snatched him up. And I honestly thought he was a better prospect than Trey Waynes, and I was one of the few people who really liked Trey Waynes coming out of Michigan State. So I think that the Vikings, at the very least, have their nickel corner of the future. So I really like those two picks from the Vikings. I can't really speak to any of their other picks besides the tight end that they drafted late, because I had to watch some stuff for him because the Eagles were interviewing him. All I can say is he is
David Morgan.
Yes, David Morgan. He's slow. He is so slow, but he will catch. He catches everything, and he blocks well. So I mean, that's I mean that probably means he's better than Kyle Rudolph, right? So maybe. But I really like the Vikings draft. I think that they improved a lot, and I'm really excited to watch their offense next year with Treadwell and Teddy.
For a guy who talks a lot about production, like Corey Coleman's 20 touchdowns or whatever, it's really interesting that you really like Laquan Treadwell, who had I think 11 touchdowns or 30% of his team's touchdowns last year, and then Mackenzie Alexander 0 interceptions, and you also like Trey Waynes, 3 interceptions in his final year of college. So
it's funny, and that I mean the thing with Treadwell is that was the one thing I was really harping on early in the season was where are the touchdowns at, where's the production at for Treadwell, because he hadn't really had it up until halfway through the season is when he really started producing. And I think John Moore of RotoViz had a great piece on Treadwell's need to produce this year to prove that he was a top-notch receiver prospect. I think he came pretty close to actually hitting the threshold that Moore set for him. I'm not positive about that, though. But yeah, Corey Coleman was still my number one receiver, and I will stand for Corey Coleman forever. But he did go to the Browns, which is where good football players go to die. So who knows? But I think that Treadwell is in a really good position, and this is the best quarterback that Treadwell's ever had. I mean, he dealt with Chad Kelly and Bo Wallace for the first.
Dr. Bo.
So, I mean, going from Bo Wallace to Chad Kelly to Teddy Bridgewater is quite the jump in quarterbacking skill. So I think that if he can produce with both of those guys at any level, having an actual good quarterback like Bridgewater is going to do wonders for his production.
All right, so that's fantastic. Thanks for everything, both your Bridgewater compliments and your draft compliments, as well as the analysis on Shermer. Any parting shots before we let you go? Anything you want to promote in particular?
I'm writing at Bleeding Green Nation. I do draft coverage for them, and I also do some miscellaneous football articles if I'm feeling like it. And check out Bleeding Green Nation, Bleeding Green Nation Radio, and then follow me on Twitter at the Ben Natan. That's BENNATAN. If you want me to, I mean, it's the off season, so I'm just tweeting about the most miscellaneous bullshit for the most part, but it's sometimes funny. So yeah, those are my parting shots. I don't really have anything prepared. I'm sorry.
Be sure to follow Ben if you love tweets about politics and not football. He's going to be tweeting probably a lot, right, as the election comes up.
Tweeting a lot Jesus. About
politics and probably less about electoral politics and a lot about race and class, just stuff that makes people really happy to talk to.
Yeah, really, and people love me, and I'm not divisive at all.
All right.
Wait, so if you're...
Thanks for coming on, Ben.
Hold on.
Yeah, absolutely.
I don't want to let you go just yet. First of all, I have a question about your Twitter handle. Who is at BG Natan? Is that not you?
That was my Twitter handle 2 days ago, and then I changed it.
Okay. So the Ben Natan is the place to find you on the Twitter.
I needed something that was a little bit more self-centered.
Well, you mean you didn't want to be mistaken for a Bowling Green?
That was the other thing. I got called out by North Dakota State Twitter. They were like, "Why are you tweeting about Carson Wentz if you cover Bowling Green?" And I was like, I don't cover Bowling Green, but okay."
A simple Google search would have rectified that for you, but that's okay. I'll just change the name of my presence on the internet. It's not a big deal.
Yeah.
Not a big deal. The last thing I was going to ask you, I hear you are in the I hear you're a Game of Thrones fan.
I am.
And I hear you are in the Down with Ollie camp.
Oh, I'm happy to see him go.
Oh, dude, as a Jon Snow enthusiast, this season has been like if the last season ended on a huge sad cliffhanger, this season has been just the most glorious comeuppance.
Oh, I totally agree, and I'm really looking forward to how John deals with Ramsey at the end of the season.
He's going to deal with it the same way he deals with everything else, by running away until the last possible second and then having an act of improbable heroism thrust upon him, and he will just like ride some unlikely alliance to victory.
I'm here for it. I'm excited about it.
That's my prediction.
That's all I have to look forward to now that football's over. I didn't actually have to look forward to football because I was an Eagles fan, but my Sunday nights are actually fun again.
Right? They should be the best night of the
it's
week
like
year round.
all over again.
Yeah. Jeez.
All right. Well, thank you so much for being on the show, Ben. We'd love to have you back again sometime.
This was really fun. Thank you so much for having me on.
Insight. You all have a good night then.
You too.
Ben Natan, not the famous deceased Israeli diplomat. We did not pull a Melisandre. No, no. There was a post World War II diplomat whose last name was Ben Natan, and
oh wait, really?
Yeah. He was instrumental in negotiating like parts of the Marshall Plan.
Oh wow!
So
all right,
we did not pull a Melisandre and bring him back from the dead and fill him full of football knowledge so that he could be on the show. That was a different person whose first name is
cruelly
Ben.
Make him an Eagles fan.
And yeah. Well, when you come back from the dead, you got to make some sacrifices, and not just in the form of like multiple draft picks. Well, all right, that was Ben Natan from the places he talked about, and now joining us in what I remind you is a Norse code first, two disparate guests in the same show, is a football coach, offensive coordinator, author. Reasonably smart person, it seems like, just to read his resume.
He's smart.
But we care most because he writes for Inside the Pylon and can offer us some specific insight into Tony Sparano. He is Ted Nguyen. How you doing, Ted?
Good. How are you guys?
Good. Happier now that you're on. Well, let's first, we'll talk a lot about Tony Sparano, sure, but let's actually talk about you for a second. Like, so you're a coach. How long have you been coaching? What got you into football? What do you like about football? That sort of stuff. Like, can you tell us a little bit about you?
Yeah, sure. I started playing football in high school, and we actually ran like a triple option offense. That's like super old school. We barely passed the ball. I played quarterback in that offense, but basically I was like an extra running back. And, I loved my experience playing football, so I decided to come back to coach, and I've been coaching ever since. And I started coaching in 2007. And, so it's been 7 years. And it was actually I took a year off. So, it's about 7-8 years. And slowly I've been learning different offenses through clinics and getting to go college campuses and visiting with college coaches, and I brought some of that knowledge into writing, which I started last year when I started my website, Raiders Analysis. And you actually gave it a huge boost because when I wrote my second article when the Raiders played the Vikings, you retweeted it and got a bunch of views that way. Yeah, so I never got to really thank you for that, but thank you.
Yeah, no problem. Yeah. It was pretty good. Or it was probably pretty good. I try not to retweet stuff I haven't read. So it was more credit to you than to me. But glad to have you on. It sounds like after you got some of that stuff, you were invited to write it Inside the Pylon.
Yeah, exactly. They saw some articles and they invited me to start writing for them, and I've been writing for them ever since.
Dude, that's awesome. That's really cool because sometimes it's like really difficult for people who put out really good content, people who are really qualified to get picked up. So, I mean, within a year, that's actually that's pretty good. I think it speaks a lot to sort of your ability to communicate what you're saying and also your ability to break down, a lot of football concepts. So we're really happy to have you on the show. You are familiar with the Raiders, and I had assumed at some point, therefore, at least a little bit familiar with Tony Sparano, which means that, I asked you to come onto the show to help break him down a little bit for us in terms of what he can bring to the offensive line. In general, before we get down into like scheme stuff and, run blocking and offensive linemen, what are your just general impressions of Sparano as a coach or as a guy?
Well, he comes from that Bill Parcells tree, so he's super old school. He's very enthusiastic, and he tries to think of different. But at the same time, he tries to think of different ways to connect and motivate his players. I don't know if you guys remember the famous burying.
Yeah, burying the football.
Yeah.
That was great.
So he's into all that kind of stuff, and you might see some of that stuff with the Vikings too. But he, I think he was a large part of changing the Raiders culture around when he became an interim head coach. Even though they didn't retain him, he got that group to stick together and buy in, and then you saw some of that pay dividends last season.
Why do you think they didn't retain him?
I don't know. I think that he's just not what they're looking for as far as a head coach. He's a motivational guy, but I think they wanted somebody, a new voice to come in, somebody with a little bigger head coaching resume.
Sure.
Mm-hmm.
That makes sense.
Yeah, I think Del Rio fit that bill, and he's done a nice job, obviously.
Yeah, no, he's done a pretty fantastic job over there. So the Vikings brought Sperano on to be their offensive line coach, replacing a well-reputed, but as of late, not well-performing offensive line coach in Jeff Davidson, who I think he got picked up by an organization that tends to coach well. So we'll see how that goes. But they brought him in to replace them. And what's interesting is that Jeff Davidson did a lot of the run scheming for North Carolina, as he did for Bill Musgrave. And therefore, there's your run coordinator functionally is gone. And my assumption is, and I haven't talked to the Vikings about this, but because this is how it worked in San Diego and how it worked in Minnesota, my assumption is that once again the offensive line coach, in this case Tony Sperano, is going to be involved in scheming the run game and being a run game coordinator. But it's not quite the same in terms of like how there's a bunch of different passing schemes. You've got West Coast, and you've got spread styles, and you've got Earhart Perkins and stuff like that. In run blocking, there's two basic schemes, but some people say there are four schemes. Some people say there's really only one scheme. What's your view on the way that run blocking is coached and the different kind of schemes that exist in run blocking? And then after that, can you tell us what Sperano likes to do?
Yeah, sure. I think there's two, general different categories of running: gap scheme running and zone running. And within those categories are smaller subcategories. And some offenses focuses more on one than the other. Like, for example, you could be a zone blocking team, but you could have an outside zone emphasis or inside zone emphasis. Like, for example, Gary Kubiak and Mike Shanahan, all those guys, they were really into outside zone, and that was their main focus of their offense. Whereas, a guy like Tony Sperano, he's more focused on running inside zone primarily as a bread and butter play.
Okay, and so can you tell us what the differences are for that?
Yeah, so gap scheming, the line is, they're responsible for a man. They learn how to block fronts, and they fire off the ball hard. They're doing down blocks, they're doing pulls, they're running traps, you're running concepts like power, ISO. Whereas in zone, you start off with the horizontal step. You're responsible for an area more than a man, and you're comboing the linebackers. So it's seen as it could be seen as less physical than gap scheme running, but it could be pretty physical too. But it's just a different technique, and there's a different difference in reads, and you could be looking for different things when you're scouting for a zone lineman versus a gap scheme lineman, and even a running back that runs better in a power scheme, or a running back that runs better in a zone blocking scheme.
What are the requirements for offensive linemen in each? Because I know a lot of times in the draft, we see this analysis of an offensive lineman, like, oh, he's more of a zone offensive lineman, or this guy's really only going to be suited for gap or power style running.
So I think people generally categorize smaller, quicker guys that are more athletic as zone blocking linemen, and guys that are just bigger as gap scheming linemen. But you're going to have to do both. You could be better at one than the other, but in the NFL, you run a little bit of everything. You might run more of one thing than the other, but you have to be able to run zone. You have to be able to run gap scheme, but you might be a little bit better at one than the other. But I think if you're just looking at like Kubiak's offense, an outside run scheme, then he might be looking, especially for smaller, athletic guys. But I think in NFL, like, you're going to have to be able to run both.
And have you been able to watch, any of the Vikings at all in terms of, any of the running that they've done? And if so, what are the changes do you think that bringing Sperano in might be able to give us?
So I did watch a little bit of the Vikings today and yesterday, and it looked like a lot of the things that I was comparing this to 2012, the 2012 Jets offense when Sperano was the offensive coordinator, because he's been an offensive line coach in different places, but he may or might not have a huge voice in the run schemes that they're running. But when he's the offensive coordinator, obviously he gets to call the shots and design that offense. So when I was comparing the two, a lot of the concepts are really similar. Like, they run a lot of inside zone, and they're pretty diverse in their run schemes. They have like old school concepts. They're running some like wing T buck sweeps. There are small differences. Like, there were differences in the backfield action. For example, Norv Turner was the former run coordinator was running buck sweep with just a normal running back without any counter action, but Sperano ran it with some counter action. So there's small differences like that. Mm-hmm. But I think as far as concepts, they're pretty similar, and they like a lot of like 2-3 man tight end surfaces. So yeah, they're pretty similar when I looked at those two.
So then, what do you think Sperano specifically looks for an offensive lineman? Because I noticed that the teams that he's been on, they tend to draft. I mean, I guess aside from Menelik Watson, they tend to draft offensive linemen very well. Like, what does he look for? Have you noticed?
I think the number one thing he's looking for is just attitude. Like, he wants a mauler, a guy with a mean streak. And I think he's a little old school in the sense that he wants the bigger guys, and he wants to run the ball. He's a run first guy, as most offensive line coaches are. And like I said, he's inside zone dominant, and he runs a lot of gap scheme stuff too at the same time. So he's looking for those bigger guys that are going to maul you.
And a lot of people, when they hear that you want like an offensive lineman with an attitude, a guy who's going to try to, I think Zimmer actually said it like a couple of days ago. We were looking for guys who will put a dent in you, I think is what he said. When a lot of people see that, they tend to think it's like the bigger Phil Loadhole type of offensive lineman. But I mean, you could have, like a smaller, like a center, right? Like Wisniewski's not like huge for a center or anything like that, but he has that kind of attitude, right? So you can have, if you're looking for the right attitude, you can have some of the smaller guys, right?
Yeah, I know. Yeah, of course. I think, a lot of it has to do with attitude. You got to want to finish. A lot of it has to do with, technique. But yeah, I think the biggest thing is attitude. You got to want to knock that guy in front of you on the ground, and that's what he's looking for.
And you said you watched a little bit of the Vikings in prep for this. Were there any offensive linemen that you thought embodied sort of these personality traits well, or maybe even offensive linemen that you were a little worried about from that perspective?
To be honest with you, I was just looking at the scheme specifically, so I wasn't really looking at the line too much. But I mean, they were getting pushed. The guys were, they were knocking the D line off the ball. But I mean, guys are just loading the box of the Vikings. I noticed it was hard to run sometimes because there's so many guys in the box.
Yeah, no, fair enough. So you talked a little bit how there's like some small differences when you talk about, there's zone and then there's like inside zone and stuff like that. And, there's a couple of teams that you mentioned that also, run, a lot of inside zone. How is Sperano's version of run blocking? The stuff that he does, that he did, with the Jets, that he may have, wanted to do in Oakland and stuff like that. How is that different than, say, what Kubiak does or what Shanahan does?
Well, what Kubiak and Shanahan want to do is they want to get outside. Their linemen are reach blocking. They're using a reach and run technique. They want to get outside. The running back's aim point is the tight end, and that's his first read. If he could get the edge, he's going to take it. If not, then he's going to cut up the field. Whereas inside zone is the running back's aim point is the B gap, and linemen are trying to just get their first step is horizontal, and the running back's first step is horizontal as well to get some outside movement. And after that, they're just trying to use momentum and open up a gap inside for the running back to cut back on. So, it's more they're looking to cut either the front side cut into the front side B gap or A gap, whereas Kubiak's main play outside zone, they're trying to get outside or into the C gap.
Okay, yeah, that makes a lot of sense. And then what are the strengths and weaknesses do you think of not just those two emphases, like inside versus outside zone, but in general the strengths and weaknesses of, like, let's say, gap running versus zone running?
Well, in gap running, you could you're hitting the hole right now. So the running back, he's not messing around. He's getting the ball at full speed and he's trying to hit a gap at full speed. And the linemen are doing the same thing. They're firing off the ball, and they're trying to hit people right now and move them. Whereas zone blocking takes a little bit more patience from the running back and the offensive line. And sometimes that could give a defense an advantage because it gives them more time to react to the play. When you're coaching a running back in a zone, you're telling him to go slow to and fast through the hole. So he's taking a little bit more time at the backfield, and that could give the defense a little bit more time to react, a little bit more time to push the offensive lineman back. Whereas, in gap scheming, you're going right now. And there's advantages to that because when you're running zone, it's harder to cover all the gaps, especially when the offensive line is moving a certain direction.
Mm-hmm.
But it's just. Yeah, when you're running zone, the defense has a little more time to react. Whereas gap scheme, it's right now. But if you don't get that blocking perfect, then you can just run straight into a wall.
Okay, yeah, so that makes a lot of sense. So a lot of times in zone running, you can create additional opportunities for your running back because he can functionally figure out which lane is sort of the best option for him. But because he starts off a little bit slower, he's not going to be able to hit the hole potentially with as much burst or acceleration as he would in a man blocking scheme, right?
Yeah, exactly. And the offensive line is moving, and as they're moving, they're trying to create a crease in the defense for the running back to run through.
So Sperano is known as a pretty good offensive line coach. I mean, that's one of the reasons that the Vikings brought him in. What do you think makes is it because you talked a little bit about it, like his motivational ability, but beyond just that, what do you think makes him a good offensive line coach?
He's very technical. I think he spends a lot of time on working technique, and that makes him a very valuable position coach, and he knows exactly what he wants. There's different type, for example, there's a double team, and you could just say it's a double team and work on double teams. Mm-hmm. But he knows different, 4 or 5 different types of double teams in different situations, and he'll drill all those different type of double teams into his linemen. So it's just, he's very detailed, and he knows the exact technique he wants for each situation, and all those things will get drilled into linemen because he's been around and he knows how to do that.
So he sort of knows, what situations the offensive lineman will hit on particular plays, and in those situations, what cues or keys to look for those offensive linemen, and how they need to react when they work on a particular technique for a particular play.
Yeah, exactly.
Well, that's great news. I think that's been an issue for the Vikings, and also, injury has also played a role. But do you think that for a person like Sperano to come in, a lot of people talk about how important it is to have offensive line chemistry. Do you think some coaches have the ability to, because of their attention to detail, do you think some coaches have the ability to maybe not transcend the need for chemistry, but overcome some of the problems that come with a rotating offensive line or a new offensive line with that attention to detail?
Yeah, definitely. I think a good offensive line coach will also coach some of his guys to be more versatile. So, you could have some movement in line because this player might know multiple positions, and I think that helps with chemistry and cohesiveness as well as depth too.
And then, were you able to? I don't know how much draft analysis you do. You do a lot of scheme breakdowns, so maybe that's all noise to you. But were you able to look at any sort of the offensive linemen in the draft? That you were curious about.
To be honest, no. I mean, if I did look at some draft stuff, it'd be with quarterbacks or wide receivers, and more in the skill position than the linemen.
Sure. Well, actually, let's talk a little bit about the Raiders in general. They're a super interesting team to me because there's kind of a almost rivalry between the Vikings and the Raiders because they got Carr and Teddy in the same draft, and they're both kind of rising teams. They have much different strengths and weaknesses, which makes it such an interesting contrast in styles. The Raiders are really well set to take the division, despite the fact that someone else in the division won the Super Bowl this year. What do you think? What do you think the Raiders need to do in order to take that next step?
They're gonna have to put it together on offense, and the defense got a lot better towards the end of the year, whereas offense kind of started suffering. I think a lot of that had to do with offensive line depth, and people forget that it was Derek Carr's, even though it was his second year, it's his first year in that offense. So I expect him to do much better in the second year in Musgrave's offense and progress a little bit and cut down those fourth quarter mistakes. Actually, a lot of the games the Raiders lost last year, they lost in the fourth quarter. They were all close games besides that first game against the Bengals. So I think with a little more maturity, a little more cohesiveness in the system, will help them get over those fourth quarter woes.
Do you think that that's been sort of a big issue for Carr over the past 2 years, is a ability to sort of close games or win games in the fourth quarter?
Yeah, I think he just tries to do too much in the fourth quarter. I mean, the game everybody thinks about is the first game against the Chiefs when the Raiders were actually up in the fourth quarter, and then Carr throws a pick six, and then he goes on to throw 3 more picks in that fourth quarter. So it's just I think it's just a maturity thing where he's going to have to learn when to try to make a play and when to just be okay with going 3 and out or having to punt the ball or kick a field goal and that kind of thing. It'll come with time and experience.
Yeah, fair enough. A lot of Raiders fans, big fans of Derek Carr. That makes sense. He's maybe one of the better. He is one of the better young quarterbacks. He might be the best of the sort of the young quarterbacks. If you could sort of rank the quarterbacks from that draft class, the 2014 draft class, and I know ranking is like meh, especially for a coach, but like if you could rank the quarterbacks coming from that draft class, Carr, Teddy, Bortles, I guess Johnny was in that draft class too. Who would you take, and why?
Well, I mean, before the draft, I actually had Carr as my number 1 quarterback. I know a lot of people say that, now looking back at it, but I did. I have the Facebook statuses to prove it. I wasn't on draft Twitter yet, but I had Carr number 1. I had Bridgewater number 2, and that's how I have it now. I have Bortles 2 and Bridgewater 3.
Ouch.
Yeah, I mean, it's not like I don't like Bridgewater, but I just think Bortles and Carr have shown a lot of potential. I mean, I think Bortles threw for more than 30 touchdowns last year as well.
A lot of touchdowns.
35.
Pretty impressive for a 35-year-old man.
And how many did Bridgewater throw for last year? It was
14.
14. Yeah, so those numbers aren't quite up there with Carr and Bortles, but I still think Bridgewater could be a pretty good quarterback. I don't think he has that blue chip potential, but he could kind of be like Alex Smith, hopefully, with Peterson running the ball and running some play actions and just being a game manager.
Do we really need more play actions?
What was that?
Do we really need more play actions?
I'm actually hoping that the Vikings spread it out a little bit more next year. I know you guys have some new wide receivers that you're excited about, and I don't want to see Peterson run into these 8-9 man boxes anymore. I want to see him prolong his career a little bit. So it'd be cool if the Vikings spread it out. Incorporate some RPOs and some option runs and take the ball out of Peterson's hands a little bit and give it to him when he has like a 6-7 man box.
And we are definitely on the same page there. Well, thanks so much for coming on, Ted. It's been great talking to you. It's been fantastic. Is there anything that you want to plug? Anything that you've written recently, or anything that you want to say before you go?
Well, I have a new article up on my website, Raiders Analysis, and it's kind of a breakdown of one of the plays I thought was a defensive play of the year by Mario Edwards Jr., and we're happy to get him back. He just got medically cleared. And, we have some great content coming out on Inside the Pylon, so, make sure to keep checking.
Okay, cool. Well, I'll link that article in the show notes and also send people over to Inside the Pylon. Thanks so much.
All right, thank you.
Thanks to Ted Nguyen at Raiders Analysis on the Twitter for all that. And
yeah, no, that was great.
I think he really did end on the dream scenario for fans of the Vikings offense, an opportunity for Adrian Peterson to be put in a situation where he can get more of those breakout runs because there's only 6 or 7 men in the box instead of the customary 2.1 to 2.2 AYPC that we've seen from him in the last couple of years.
Yeah, no, I mean that's been a pretty familiar complaint. I think, RPOs would be a really fantastic thing to add to the offense. But yeah, it's been a familiar complaint that Norv is willing to run the ball at 9-man boxes with 7 blockers, when really it'd be nice to if you had 5 blockers in the box and only 6 men in the box, see what Peterson can do against that 6th man instead of what Peterson can do against the 9th man. So. Definitely hoping that the addition of Shurmur and Sperano can lead to that. But aside from Sperano and Shurmur discussions, there's a little bit of Vikings news that we can talk about, right, Dusty?
That is accurate. But there was one thing from the Ted Nguyen portion of the show that regrettably he didn't have time to answer with the 3 of us. But I wanted to ask you specifically about Ted was talking about the history of Sperano and zone run blocking instead of man run blocking, right? Now, right. And the value that it has in terms of allowing a running back to take a little more time and get a little less burst, but potentially get a longer route. Doesn't that seem like kind of the opposite of Adrian Peterson's skill set? And doesn't he have kind of a history of resisting attempts to change that?
I think that when you read about some of the deficiencies in Peterson's game, that seems to be the case. But his best runs have been off of zone blocking runs. The Vikings were a zone blocking team before Davidson came, and then they were sort of a multiple team with both zone and man blocking. And he did a little bit better in those zone runs than he did in those man runs. So you'd think that because a lot of people talk about his lack of patience and stuff like that. And that one of the big improvements that he made in 2012 was adding patience. But honestly, with the difference between, what Peterson can do is read defenses very well and read his blocking very well. And in zone blocking, you give your running back a lot more options. So yeah, you have to worry about, his ability to be patient. But his quick acceleration pairs well with zone blocking because you have to go from slow to fast really quick, as opposed to building up a head of steam and power blocking. And he can pick his hole, which in a lot of run blocking, there's not multiple holes to pick from because of the way that it's blocked. So it seems like that wouldn't fit Peterson very well, but it's fit him well historically. I also do want to add, Ted did mention that he has added in some man runs on the Daily Norseman piece about Tony Sperano. I talked a lot about man blocking. It's interesting. The way that I picked up Sperano was that I saw him as a gap blocking guy, especially based off of the articles I read about the Jets and the articles I read about the Raiders and the stuff that I saw with the Raiders. And what Ted saw was a lot of zone blocking, which is not what I saw. Ted, obviously, he's an offensive coordinator. He goes to a bunch of clinics. He knows a lot better than I do. So I was researching this as we were talking on the show. And the Jets initially were a zone blocking team and changed with a more to add emphasis to man blocking over the course of the year. And so, which that was super interesting to me because I didn't pick up on that. And so this kind of adds to the thing, that Ben was talking about with Shurmur, that Sperano changes what the offensive line does and what the running does in order to sort of best suit what they're doing well with. So even if it's not the case that Peterson fits this, it could be the case that Sperano implements changes that best complement Peterson's running style.
Indeed, and that is why I wanted to ask you about that. Anyway, to get back to your point, yeah, there is a little bit of Vikings news to springboard off of a conversation we started last week about Moritz das Einhorn Böhringer. Even Mike Zimmer is on board with letting the story come to an end, at least in terms of the PR blitz that's surrounding somebody who is probably not going to make the team. But there have been kind of acknowledgments that this is part of a larger PR program to generate more interest in the NFL in countries in Europe where American football is played, but the NFL is not very popular, like, say, Germany.
Right. Germany has a really, really strong, relatively speaking, American Football League, probably the strongest out of all the European countries. The best way to grow, the best asset you have, is to make players excited about, playing in the German Football League. And if you can get someone onto an NFL roster, potentially, who knows, from the German Football League, I think that's a huge PR plus. And especially because, those contracts aren't bad either. A huge, maybe not incentive, but reason to pay attention to the German Football League when you're in Germany. So, yeah, no, for sure you could generate some interest. I've always been kind of curious, or not always, but since the draft pick, I've been kind of curious about, what percentage of this was PR driven, what percentage of this was like team driven. And given that 3 or 4 other teams, including the Falcons specifically, were interested in drafting Böhringer in the 6th round, it seems like there were some pretty healthy football reasons to pick him too.
Well, and the Vikings were interested in signing him before the draft, were it not for his age and the particular value of getting a bargain on him in the draft because of his pro year status. Like he was in the year after his 4 years of high school where teams could have gotten a discount on him, and that was the only reason the Vikings didn't sign him.
No, it was the NFL ruled that he had to enter the draft.
Okay, reason. because he is so young, because he is really a child of 22, a 6'3", 230-pound child of 22.
Yeah, that's the reason. But beyond Böhringer, and I did send some clips to Böhringer to Matt Waldman, who's been on the show. I think, yeah, he's been on the show.
I love how we're at the point where it's like, well, we're pretty sure these guys have been on the show, but yes, no, Waldman is definitely in the pantheon of Norse Code. Yes.
Yeah, so I sent some clips of Böhringer to Matt Waldman, who had an excellent video breaking down some of the stuff from the highlight film that he saw. So I sent some clips that the Vikings posted of highlights to see if some of the details that Waldman saw were evolving or improving or changing. And yeah, it definitely seemed like it. Waldman had nice things to say about the 2 plays that he saw that were curated by the Vikings. So obviously, boulders of salt, I guess. But what he did see was nice. There's an improvement in his speed cut. That's one of the things Waldman specifically identified, is that Böhringer's speed cut wasn't great, in the GFL. It still isn't very good, but there's a lot of improvement there. And then he also liked sort of the flexibility that Böhringer showed in his highlights. So some good stuff from the rookie minicamp of Böhringer, which is really nice to see. At the very least, he should be beating up on rookie tryout players, and it seems like, based off of the very little that we've seen, that's the case.
In between vomit sessions on the sidelines?
Yeah, that happened. Pretty sure he's just not used to the practice schedule.
Hey, that's a sign that you're working extra hard. My wrestling coach in middle school / high school always, like, he did not discourage that sort of thing from happening, and suggested that it was merely just a stepping stone on the road to ultimate athletic performance. So more power to Morbo.
The body.
Yeah, exactly. Speaking of weakness leaving the body, actually no, that is a terrible segue.
It's an awful segue.
I have nothing to add on that point. But speaking of Vikings acquisitions. One of them is at a player with a clear position, CJ Ham.
Yeah, he's a running back from Augusta, I think. Augustana.
Augusta is the golf course.
Oh, well, that would have been super interesting.
Well, they don't allow women or black people at Augusta, so it would not make very much sense for him to be from there.
They have recently allowed black people, Dusty. It's an evolving process.
Well, at least we're making some sort of progress. At any rate, none of this has anything to do with CJ Ham, who is now a Viking. There's a great photo of Mike Zimmer wearing a flight suit for indiscernible reasons on the Associated Daily Norseman article that you can read at dailynorseman.com.
Oh, fantastic. We'll link that article in the show notes. Some bits about CJ Ham. He's 5'11", 235 pounds, so pretty squat guy. And he played in the spread offense. Lindsey Young has a great, friend of the show, Lindsey Young, has a great piece up on Vikings.com that talks a little bit about it. So he's a decent receiver. He had 39 receptions for 431 yards. And he largely played in a zone style scheme, so maybe that'll transfer well to working with the Vikings. And in 2015, he rushed for 1,097 yards in 12 games with 16 touchdowns.
Well, I'm thinking of somebody who is my height with 40 extra pounds on his frame. Like, I don't know if he has the same frame shape as I do, like long legs and long arms and functionally nothing else. But either way, the idea of somebody my size with 40 extra pounds attached to them is borderline frightening. So
there's a reason he's been asked to play both fullback and running back.
Sorry, I'm just looking up stats on I think it's CJ Anderson, who is also 5'8" and 224 pounds. Yes, another fire plug running back. I don't know that
5'11" is a little different than 5'8", Dusty.
I mean, yes, but I feel like once you get below the 6 foot mark, you're aiming for the low angles, and maybe CJ Anderson is somehow even shorter and made of muscle, as these images are leading me to believe. But
one or rather two notable things about CJ Ham. His vertical jump of 37 inches is extraordinary for a 230-pound person. And I need to do some more complete surveys of what all the Vikings invites have or all the Vikings contracts have, but I believe that puts him at having the 6th best vertical jump of anybody on the roster. So for a running back, that translates more into explosion than actual leaping ability. But that's some pretty good stuff.
15-year-old Ben Natan writes, he can jump really high.
Exactly.
Other news in Vikings player moves: former Minnesota Golden Gophers player Troy Stoudermeyer. Don't forget that first R.
Not Studemeyer.
Stoudermeyer is a wide receiver for the Vikings, despite being a defensive back for the Gophers and also a kick return specialist.
Well, he was both a defensive back and a wide receiver at different times, I believe, with the Gophers. He is FBS football's all-time leader in kickoff return yardage.
Yes,
with 3,615 yards on 144 returns, and so that's likely the first place they'll have him. He's played in the CFL and the NFL. Or not really played in the NFL. He's been on an NFL team. He went undrafted in 2013, released by the Bengals on their cut down to 75. Picked up by the Saskatchewan Roughriders that same year, and it was released a year later, and then picked up by Bud Grant's former team, Winnipeg Blue Bombers, and he had some highlight punt returns there. So after that season, he signed by the Vikings.
Another player signed by the Vikings, Trey Roberson, not Trey Robertson. Although it's funny because the Trey Roberson that played for Indiana was a quarterback. But apparently the Trey Roberson, who, shares a social security number and a birth date with the one who played for the Hoosiers, is now a cornerback for the Vikings.
Yeah, and that's a good distinction to make because those names sound familiar, quarterback and cornerback. But he will be playing as a defensive back with the Vikings, a convert, in part because he is a little short to be a quarterback, and also because evidently, he's not a good enough quarterback. Although I don't know about that. I felt like he was good enough to be an undrafted free agent quarterback. But
he was good enough to beat
case.
Functionally everyone except for the great Carson Wentz in 2014.
Right. I think he played against Carson Wentz in the national championship game.
That is accurate where he was defeated.
Where he was defeated. So, cannot be a quarterback. But the thing about him is that he is extremely athletic for a quarterback, mildly athletic for a cornerback. If you compare him to other cornerbacks, I ran his scores. So there's kind of an interesting story about his 40-yard dash times. There's some disagreement about them. So if you look up his 40-yard dash time on NFLDraftScout.com, it has the same time that a lot of agents have and that a lot of NFL teams have, 4.52. He ran, according to a lot of people, 2 40s, one a 4.52 and one a 4.54 at the pro day held at Northwestern. But he had 2 pro days. He had one March 8th at Northwestern and then once, I believe, on March 23rd at Illinois State. And at one of these 2 pro days, he actually ran a 4.38 40, which fits some of these other measurables really well. So he's got a 3-cone of 6.79 seconds, very fast. He's got a vertical jump of 37.5 inches, so that's even better than that running back, and a broad jump of 10 feet 1 inch, which is pretty good.
Well, wait.
So
we want to take the gestalt of all of these results and just agree that he is fast and athletic rather than splitting hairs over the, 0.05 seconds maybe in the difference between 40 times.
Well, like 0.15 seconds, which ends up becoming pretty significant. So that's why it's interesting to me, because 4.54 and 4.38 are pretty far apart when it comes to 40 times. But here's the thing, regardless of which source you look at, his 10-yard and 20-yard split times match a 4.4 guy. In fact, the 1.47 second 10-yard split is one of the fastest I have in the database, period. And so it's likely that he runs closer to that 4.4 time than the 4.5 time.
The rest of the data tends to support the belief that he is a pretty fast dude.
Yeah, exactly. So we've got a bunch of data that has us that should tell us that the prior assumption should be that he's faster instead of average, right? Yeah. So that's what's interesting. So if you run those numbers, if you take, say, the 4.38 number, right, and if you run those numbers, his number ends up being in the top 19th percentile of all cornerbacks and cornerback athleticism scores in my database, which is pretty good, despite the fact that his arms are not 32 inches. They're still pretty long, 31 3/4 inches. So, splitting hairs again. And not being 6 feet tall, he's 5'11 and 7/8, another hair to split. 196 pounds, so he's not skinny like Trey Waynes. It'll be interesting to see what he does. Probably doesn't make the team or practice squad, but definitely very athletic. There's going to be a huge learning curve for this dude because he played quarterback in college.
And finally, speaking of not making the team or the practice squad, and in answer to Alex Jury's mailbag question from last week, the 2 punters who tried out with the Vikings have not been signed and probably won't be, given that the signings of Stoudermeyer and Roberson bring the Vikings roster to 90 players.
Yeah, and the signing of C.J. Ham was accompanied by waiving John Loudermilk, safety formerly of the Vikings. So they're at 90. And that's kind of interesting because the Vikings are still going to have a tryout with Ben Lecomte of NDSU, punter, who a lot of people were kind of excited by. Obviously did not get drafted. But they didn't like what they saw, I guess, enough in Nick O'Toole or I had already forgot his name, the guy from, I think it's Texas Tech, Jeffrey Simnick or something like that. And those are the 2 tryout punters that were vying for a contract. Neither of them got the contract, although Chris Thomason of the Pioneer Press, I don't know why I keep pronouncing it like that. Chris Thomason of the Pioneer Press did report that he stayed an extra night, hopefully banging out some contract details with the Vikings. That never happened. So the Vikings are probably waiting on a tryout from LeCompte, and they might still offer a contract to either LeCompte or Simnek, and will end up cutting someone else that they either have in the roster they signed as the UDFA in order to make room for a punter. But as it stands right now, there's no competition for the punter spot with Jeff Locke.
Taylor Semank is the name you're looking for.
Semank, that's pretty close.
You were very
sorry,
close.
dude.
You were much closer than I usually am when I get the wrong name in my head. So kudos to you. Last note before we hit our very brief mailbag. Chris Carter out at ESPN. Randy Moss in.
Yeah, that's kind of interesting. So I'm not entirely sure what precipitated both Ray Lewis and Chris Carter leaving ESPN, but they weren't. Neither of them were amazing, for being honest. Chris Carter, though, shockingly good at picking games. In PickWatch's database over the last 5 years, over 130 experts, Chris Carter is top 5 over 5 years in accuracy in picking games, which is slightly better than Vegas. So I don't know what to make of that. Distribution rules will tell us that even in arbitrarily good picker or a picker that's as good or even worse than Vegas, if you put 100 of them together, that some of them will end up better than Vegas. So maybe it's just, dumb luck. But that's interesting. It's kind of weird that his analysis has always been pretty bad. But it might have just been embarrassing. I mean, he's the fall guy, and he's broken some news that turned out not to be true, including the Adrian Peterson trade that I also reported that turned out not to be true. And I guess maybe those played a role. Maybe he just doesn't have enough on-air chemistry. But Randy Moss coming in, super interesting. The few times I had occasion to see him on Fox Sports, because I try not to watch that station that much, the few times I have seen him on Fox Sports, he has been fantastic. He's funny. He's charismatic. He can communicate pretty well. His knowledge of the game and stuff like that. So hopefully, that move to ESPN will be seamless, or as close to seamless as possible, and hopefully we get to see a lot of him on TV. Kind of interesting. Randy Moss followed Chris Carter on the football field, and then he follows him in the broadcast booth.
Well, I would say he followed and then eclipsed him.
Surpassed
on the football field, and may easily do the same on ESPN. Although I will say that I saw him a little bit on Fox Sports, but who else I saw on Fox Sports was Tim Tebow. And believe it or not, Tim Tebow is a pretty engaging analyst, even if he does not have the kind of command of facts and data that we are accustomed to on North Code.
Well, that's kind of interesting. I didn't know that he was on Fox Sports because I know he is an ESPN employee, sort of, with the SEC network, which is like subcontracted to ESPN or something, some relationship. And I agree with you. He's been fantastic when I've seen him, both as an analyst in general, and actually he's done some game broadcasting too, and he's been good at that. So kind of surprising. Didn't expect it. He is pretty phenomenal, though.
Handsome, well-spoken. That's really all you need.
The well-spoken part is difficult to come by.
Well, that's literally the only reason I'm here. It's unfortunately, we don't do a video version of the show, so y'all can't see how handsome I am. But those are really the only
they
two
would just
talents.
Confuse you with Hank Green, man.
That may or may not be true. On to the mailbag. Logan Reed writes in via email. Can Marcus Sherrills return kicks? If Patterson isn't any better as a true wide receiver this year, I don't really want him taking a roster spot just for one skill, but I do want to make sure we have the kick return spot well in hand.
That is a fair point for a couple of reasons. The first, actually, is that the new kickoff rule, designed to reduce the number of kickoffs, may increase the number of kickoff returns. So the new kickoff rule moves the kickoff return line even further up the field, I think to the 25, which is what it is in college. I haven't looked it up in a little bit. I should know these things. But it may encourage kickers to not want to boot it out of the end zone. So the idea was that a kicker would have even more incentive to just stay where he was and not return the ball. That's true. If they're in the end zone, they have more incentive now to stay where they were. But now, because the average return brings you to the 22-yard line or the 21-yard line, depending on which team you're on. It may be better to force a return than it is to get the ball in the end zone or get a touchback. So we may see more kick returns. Weird situation, NFL. You did a bad job. But as a result, kick returning might be more important now than it was even before they moved the kickoff line up to like the 35-yard line. And so as a result, a kick returner might be like Patterson might be more important. It's really difficult to tell because we don't know how teams actually will respond or how kick return dynamics change as a result of this or, whatever. And it might be less important. A lot of people theorize that it might be more important. We'll see. But it does kind of cheese me that like someone is taking a roster spot just for kick returns when the average field position that you get from an average kick returner is around, like I just said, the 21, 22-yard line. And Patterson's average kick return brought the Vikings to like the 24, 25-yard line. That said, the average returner doesn't get as many kick return touchdowns as Patterson. It's just that Patterson's booms are well remembered. His bust kick returns are not that well remembered. He's still one of the best kick returners in the league, but being the best still puts you in a weird category in terms of kickoff field position. That said, the Vikings were the best in the NFL in field position after a kickoff, in part because of Patterson. So he does add to the offense without being a receiver. To answer the specific question about whether or not Marcus Sherrills can return kicks, yes, he can, and I believe he can return kicks slightly better than average than the average kick returner. So that might be a reason enough to boot Patterson. But we'll see. There's a couple of kick returners. Trey Roberson. Maybe we'll see Moritz Behringer as a kick returner. He returned 15 kicks in the GFL, 2 of them for touchdowns, which is kind of incredible, I think. And was potentially one of the better kick returners in the league. Did not get enough kick returns, which is 20, to qualify on the kick return leaderboard. But only 2 kick returners in the entire German football league did get enough. So I don't know what that says. There's probably another kick returner in training camp too. I wouldn't be surprised to see, Jerick McKinnon, Jarrell Presley, an undrafted free agent, also get shots at the kick return. It's difficult to see a situation where someone beats out Patterson as a pure kick returner, but it is not difficult to see a situation where someone is average or above average at kick returning and therefore justifies their spot on the roster better than Patterson justifies his spot. We'll see. I'm kind of curious to see how this goes because Patterson's not locked to make the roster, but it is also weird to say, hey, I think Behringer is going to make the roster above him or something.
Second to last question from Sean Smith at Eldon Romani on Twitter. And this goes directly to what Ben was saying earlier about Teddy being given an opportunity to have a big ball receiver. How much does Treadwell's skill in the short to intermediate range open up Jarius Wright deep from the slot?
This is a good question in part because I think it recognizes that there are different kinds of slot receivers, which is like, for some reason, been really difficult for people to recognize. Like, not everybody is Wes Welker or Eddie Royal. Like, there's Victor Cruz's and Jarius Wrights who are like deep shot slot receivers, or there's, Marcus Colston's or Larry Fitzgerald who are like, bigger slot receivers that can either play underneath or very often deep. And Jarius Wright is definitely in that second category of like, a deep shot wide receiver. Treadwell definitely seems like the kind of guy who wins a lot underneath. I've mentioned before that, he's really great at these comebacks. He should be pretty good at slants. They didn't run them as much as I would have liked at Ole Miss. They still ran them and he was still pretty good at them. And he should be pretty good at these underneath routes, especially because his stopping ability and his ability to get into place really immediately, I think is the word I want to use, is pretty good. So it should allow him to be open underneath. I don't know how much that'll impact the defense in terms of opening up stuff deep, because I don't think safeties were going to bite for Treadwell or run to attack him. So I don't know that it'll have an impact in terms of making things easier for a deep shot, especially Jarius Wright, who is a pretty good deep shot from the slot, but is still not an astounding enough receiver to command a lot of attention either from the offense or the defense. But I do think that Treadwell's ability to exploit zones is going to make it very difficult for defenses to call coverage because Stephon Diggs is not just also good at exploiting zones, but he can do some pretty good stuff against man coverage underneath as well. And so I think it's going to make things pretty interesting for Stephon Diggs, and it's going to help Stephon Diggs because he can play off the line of scrimmage more often, and his release won't be as big an issue, and his play against bigger quarterbacks won't be as big of an issue because Treadwell is going to be there on the line of scrimmage. And that's going to help things. So I think that the bigger impact will be on Stephon Diggs and less on Jarius Wright.
It seems like in general, the style of coaching and the players that are being brought into this like new scheme or schemes is designed to create a lot of question marks in terms of other teams' defenses trying to figure out our offense. Like, is it going to be a zone blocking or a man blocking scheme for Adrian Peterson? Well, that's a big question mark. What's the line going to do? Is it going to be a, straight downfield pass play towards Stephon Diggs, or is it going to be, crossing routes? There's going to be a lot of question marks. And the players that we are trying to attract seem to be very good at, following a play as it's evolving and making a lot of heads-up decisions to try and read and confuse defenses while giving other teams maybe not so much information from week to week to deal with in terms of watching film and trying to figure out how to play against us.
Yeah, having a multitude of options and a multitude of offensive styles does make it difficult for the defense in terms of like guessing what to do and stuff like that. It is interesting. It does also mean that the offense is going to be a little bit less nailed down on the specific details of what they're doing on any particular play. And the Vikings, in many offenses in general, are banking that the ambiguity to the defense is going to be well worth it. For sure that's going to be something that the Vikings will try to exploit. They've got different kinds of passing options, like you just mentioned. They also have different kinds of running options. And I think that if they include some of the stuff that Ted was talking about, like RPOs, which are read pass options, which are passing plays and running plays in the same play, harder to do in the NFL than in college because of the eligibility rules being 1 yard down the field or 3 yards down the field, but still pretty good plays. Making the defense guess is something that I think offenses generally win out on, but you do have to be careful because you have to make sure that the offense is drilled down in the specific skill of the specific play that they're on, and having a wide range of plays might make that difficult.
Well, and I guess what I was getting at is that I think the Vikings are in a good spot for bringing in young players that have a particular talent for being flexible in their space.
Yeah, no, for sure. And hopefully the offensive line will continue to show sort of the diversity of talent that the Vikings have offensively with players like, Adrian Peterson and Stephon Diggs and Laquan Treadwell.
Maybe we could show up with our starting offensive line for more than one game this season.
Yeah, and that would be
that might help
useful
a little.
Yeah.
Well, I think that's going to do it for Norse Code 132. Unless you have any parting shots or items you would like to promote.
No, I'm going to get a Willie Beavers piece up soon, breaking him down in this fit within the Vikings offense. I'd hoped that I'd been able to talk to the Vikings specifically about their scheme, attend the film session. It looked like for a little bit that I was going to be able to attend the Vikings film session so I could, break down Willie Beavers in the context of the Vikings scheme. But it looks like, that won't be a possibility. So I'll just write the Willie Beavers piece up as soon as possible, get that up either Thursday or Friday at Cold Omaha.
Cold Omaha, the suddenly overweening Minnesota sports site. And what a great history. I had no idea what Cold Omaha meant. I believed that it had something to do with Peyton Manning because living in Denver, I believe that the entire American cultural and political orbit is centered around us. But it turns out it had something to do with what Hubert Humphrey said in a congressional hearing in the state legislature about how if Minnesota did not commit to having good sports teams, they would just end up a colder Omaha, Nebraska.
Colder Omaha, yeah. It's a very specific reference to throw back, but I kind of appreciate it now that I've learned it.
And no one wants to be a cold Omaha.
Exactly.
No one. So make sure you check that out. Also, Ben Natan at the Ben Natan on Twitter writes for SB Nation, Bleeding Green Nation, I believe it's called.
Yeah, Bleeding Green Nation.
Bleeding Green Nation. And also withthefirstpick.com. Ted Nguyen, our other...
used to write for With the First Pick. I don't think he's with them anymore.
Either way, you can check out some of his work there. It's all archived.
Yeah, sure.
Ted Nguyen is at Raiders Analysis on Twitter, writes for Inside the Pylon. You could probably find him on a football field in the fall, blowing a whistle and yelling at people younger than him.
As is tradition.
As he does. And you can find Arif at Arifus on NFL on Twitter. I am at Dusty O'Connell. The show is at Norse Code DN. The feed is run by our producer James, who is at Big Mono. You can find the show at dailynorseman.com or also wherever fine podcasts are aggregated. We're on Google Play Music. Still waiting to get a single download from Google Play Music, but we're there. And, iTunes, Stitcher, et cetera, et cetera. Be sure to check out our Facebook page, facebook.com/Daily Norseman. I've been slacking off a little bit on the link updates, but we'll get there. There'll be more as there's more news, I guess. Will be what I'll say to that. Frankly, you can just listen to the number one podcast for your Minnesota Vikings and get maybe a little bit more in-depth version of the Minnesota Vikings football landscape with perhaps a little bit different inputs from various guests than you otherwise would. If you feel like that's worth anything to you, then paypal.me/NorseCode for a one-time contribution or patreon.com/NorseCode for a recurring membership contribution. Literally any amount you want would just warm the cockles of my heart if you were to donate. Or actually, you could just keep listening. And realistically, if you continue listening to the show and you tell a friend who doesn't really internet what podcasts are and show them on their phone how to download them and just subscribe to Norse Code for them, that would be even better. That's almost better than money for us, because we would like to keep breaking records thanks to you, our phenomenal listeners. So until next week, I guess that's going to do it for us. Our formula is this: keep Teddy alive, and we'll see you then. Norse Code is the official podcast of the Daily Norseman SB Nation blog and is produced with cooperation from Pompous Jerk Productions. Pompous Jerk Productions. Attitude with attitude. The opinions expressed in this podcast are solely those of their contributors and do not reflect official positions of the Minnesota Vikings, SB Nation, the Daily Norseman staff, or PJP. No information in this podcast should be construed as gambling advice. Please obey all local gaming laws.
Our formula is this: we go out, we hit people in the mouth.